The sun hung low over the scarred plains of Marilyn, casting jagged shadows across the battlefield where remnants of a once proud army lay strewn. Mason Carter knelt beside a fallen comrade, fingers brushing dirt from a lifeless face. His chest tightened, a dull ache pressing behind his ribs. Around him, the wind whistled through the husks of shattered machines and broken dreams, carrying the faint scent of charred metal and scorched earth. Somewhere beyond the ridge, laughter rose, harsh, alien, unkind. He lifted his gaze toward the sound, fists curling reflexively. Across the plain, galactic soldiers in gleaming armor moved like shadows, their laughter drifting on the wind as they surveyed the ruined American platoon. Mason's lips thinned into a hard line. Blood smeared his temple, and a ragged gash tore through the sleeve of his uniform. His left leg throbbed with each shift of weight, but his eyes burned with a light that no injury could extinguish. "Captain," a voice whispered nearby. Mason turned to see Kayla Ortiz, the team's combat medic, crouching low behind a twisted beam. Her olive skin was streaked with grime, dark eyes sharp despite the exhaustion etched into her features. She held a trembling hand to her side, blood seeping between her fingers, but her expression remained fierce. "We have to move. They'll sweep the field soon." Mason nodded once, jaw tightening. He reached for her, pulling her to her feet with a quiet grunt. She stumbled but regained her balance, biting back a hiss of pain. Together, they edged toward the remnants of an overturned transport, seeking what little cover remained. Behind them, the sounds of the enemy's amusement grated like sandpaper against Mason's nerves. As they moved, Ren Langley emerged from the smoke, rifle slung across his back. His blonde hair was matted with sweat, his freckled face pale but determined. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before they push in," he murmured, glancing between Mason and Kayla. "The others are gone, Cap. It's just us now." Mason closed his eyes briefly, letting the weight of that truth settle into his bones. When he opened them, there was steel in his gaze. "Then we hold," he said simply. "We hold until we can't." Ren gave a grim smile, eyes glinting with something between admiration and fatalism. "I figured you'd say that." Above them, the sky was bruised purple, stars beginning to flicker to life in the deepening dusk. The galactic soldiers moved with calculated grace, their armored figures a sharp contrast against the ruin. Mason's mind raced, calculating distance, cover, escape routes, anything to buy them time. His fingers grazed the comm unit at his belt, its cracked surface sparking faintly. "Dead." He exhaled sharply through his nose, gaze darting to Kayla as she pressed a fresh bandage against her ribs. "Kayla," Mason murmured, voice low but firm. She looked up, weary but alert. "If it comes to it, you run. Don't look back." Her jaw tightened. "I'm not leaving you behind." Mason's lips twitched, a shadow of a smile. "That's an order." Kayla shook her head, eyes gleaming with unshed tears. "You can order all you want, Mason. You know damn well I'm not going." Ren let out a soft chuckle, crouching beside them. "Well, at least we'll go out with some flair," he muttered, adjusting the strap on his rifle. Mason shot him a look, but there was no heat in it, only gratitude for the levity in the face of doom. The laughter from the galactic soldiers faded, replaced by sharp, clipped commands. Mason tensed, breath catching in his throat. He could feel it, the shift in the air, the electric pulse of imminent violence. His heart drummed a steady rhythm, grounding him as his fingers closed around his sidearm. The first blast came without warning, a searing arc of plasma that sliced through the night. Mason shoved Kayla down, rolling behind the wreckage as Ren returned fire. The night erupted in sound and fury, the sharp retort of gunfire mixing with the whine of alien weapons. Mason's world narrowed to the beat of his heart, the heat of the barrel, the shape of Kayla's trembling form beside him. They fought like cornered wolves, teeth bared, eyes blazing. Mason moved with precision born of desperation, each shot deliberate, each movement measured. Beside him, Kayla worked to stem the bleeding at her side, even as she passed spare magazines to Ren. The air crackled, thick with smoke and fear, but Mason clung to the thread of purpose that had carried him this far. Minutes stretched into small eternities. Mason's ears rang, the world blurring at the edges. But then, amid the chaos, a sudden, deafening silence. He blinked, chest heaving, and slowly lifted his head. The ridge was still. Galactic Soldiers stood frozen at its crest, visors gleaming, weapons lowered. A figure stepped forward, distinct from the rest. Taller, broader, cloaked in armor etched with jagged gold. Commander Vecrus, known across star systems as a butcher, a strategist, a name mothers whispered in warning. His voice crackled through the stillness, amplified by unseen tech. American soldier, Vecrus intoned, his accent smooth, lilting with faint amusement. You fought well, admirable, even, but you are broken, and you are finished. Mason rose slowly, hands empty, body aching with every breath. His gaze swept the enemy ranks, then settled on Vecrus. We're not broken, he said quietly, voice rough but unwavering. Not finished. Vecrus tilted his head, amusement flickering in his stance. No, look around you. Mason's eyes flicked to Ren, pale and gasping, blood staining his uniform. To Kayla, leaning heavily against the transport, lips pressed into a thin line of defiance. To the bodies scattered across the plain, the smoke curling upward like prayers. He looked back at Vecrus and smiled. You'll live to regret this. The words hung in the air, soft but sharp as a blade. For a heartbeat, the battlefield held its breath. And then Kayla, with trembling hands, raised her weapon. Ren shifted, lifting his rifle with a grunt of effort. Mason straightened, shoulders squared, gaze blazing with something unyielding. For the first time, Vecrus hesitated. The moment fractured. A distant rumble echoed across the plains, low and rising, a sound Mason recognized instantly. Reinforcements. The comm unit on Vecrus's belt crackled to life, a flurry of static and urgent voices. Mason saw it, the flicker of calculation, the faint tightening of Vecrus's jaw, and in that flicker, Mason saw hope. The Galactic Soldiers shifted, unease rippling through their formation. Mason took a slow, measured breath, heart hammering as the rumble grew louder, closer. Dust rose on the horizon, the unmistakable shape of Allied transports cresting the ridge. Kayla let out a shaky laugh, the sound half-choked with exhaustion. Ren's mouth curved into a crooked grin. Mason simply watched as Vecrus raised a hand, issuing a curt command. The soldiers began to withdraw, lines breaking with practiced precision. As the last of the galactic forces vanished beyond the ridge, Mason sank to his knees, adrenaline draining like water from a shattered dam. Kayla slid down beside him, head resting on his shoulder, breath hitching with mingled relief and exhaustion. We're not finished, Mason murmured again, quieter this time, as if speaking to himself. Ren dropped beside them, rifle clattering to the ground. I don't know how you do it, Cap, he muttered, voice rough with a laugh. You're a damn miracle worker. Mason shook his head slowly, eyes fixed on the distant lights of the approaching reinforcements. Not a miracle, he murmured. Just stubborn. Kayla chuckled softly, fingers curling weakly around Mason's sleeve. Stubborn's what kept us alive. The three of them sat together in the settling dust, the night cool against their skin, the taste of survival sharp and bittersweet on their tongues. Behind them, the battlefield waited, quiet and spent. Before them, a new horizon stretched, uncertain and wide. And though their bodies trembled, though their hearts bore the weight of everything they had lost. Mason felt it, deep in his bones, the unbroken thread of defiance that bound them. Tomorrow would bring more battles, more loss, more sacrifice. But tonight they had won, and that was enough to carry them forward. The battlefield quieted, but the soldier's heart raced as if the fight still raged in his veins. Around him, the rebel fighters gathered their dead and wounded, their weary eyes flicking toward the horizon where the Galactic Soldiers had retreated. The soldier, leaning heavily on his rifle, scanned the faces, men, women, even adolescents, each marked by dirt, ash, and the unmistakable burn of defiance. A young rebel approached, the same soot-streaked fighter who had recognized him during the fight. Her name was Kayla, a wiry figure with sharp green eyes and a braid streaked with ash and sweat. She extended a trembling canteen. "Here, you need this," she murmured. Her voice cracked under exhaustion, but there was steel beneath it. He accepted it without a word, tilting it back, the water hitting his dry throat like a shock. Kayla crouched beside him, eyes darting over the scorched earth. "You're the one they called the Ghost Soldier, right? We heard about you over the channels. They said you held the ridge alone for 2 days." He lowered the canteen, wiping his mouth with the back of his dirt-streaked hand. 2 days, he echoed softly, as if trying the words on for size. His voice was rough, each word pulled from a throat lined with smoke and fatigue. Kayla shifted, her gaze lingering on the body of his horse, still lying in the dust, its flank charred where stray fire had hit. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, voice almost a whisper. The soldier's fingers tightened on the canteen for a moment, then loosened. He gave a single, shallow nod, his jaw working, but no words came. The rebels began moving, gathering weapons, salvaging supplies. Someone shouted orders. The soldier straightened, pain lancing up his leg, but he forced it down, forced himself to stand taller. Kayla rose with him, watching carefully. "Command wants to meet you," she said. "They're setting up at the ravine. We regroup there." The march was slow. The soldier limped at the rear, his rifle a makeshift cane, the weight of the fallen pressing into his every step. Around him, the rebels were little more than shadows, bone-tired and half-starved. But there was something in their posture, a stubborn lift of the chin, a refusal to break, that reminded him of the men and women he had lost. The ravine came into view as dusk bled across the sky. Fires flickered among the rocks, their smoke curling into the darkening air. Makeshift tents lined the cliffs, voices murmuring low and urgent. At the center of it all waited Commander Wren, a broad-shouldered woman with silver-streaked hair and a scar that split her cheek like a jagged line of defiance. Her eyes fixed on the soldier as he approached, sharp as a hawk's. "You're the American?" she asked without preamble. Her voice was low, steady, cutting through the noise around them. The soldier nodded once. "Name's Mason." Wren's gaze flicked over him, taking in the torn uniform, the hastily bandaged wounds, the battered rifle. "You're lucky," she said, though her tone held no softness. "But I'm guessing luck's only part of it." Mason met her eyes evenly. "I'm guessing you didn't survive this long on luck either." A flicker of amusement crossed Wren's face, gone as quickly as it came. She gestured toward a map spread across a makeshift table. "We're planning a strike," she said. "Galactic forces are regrouping at the stronghold north of here. We hit them now, we cripple their hold on this sector." Mason leaned in, eyes narrowing as he studied the map. Roads, ridges, defense points, it was all familiar, all a language he spoke in his bones. "They'll have reinforcements coming in," he murmured. "Heavy weapons, mechs. You don't hit them fast, you'll be buried." Wren's brow lifted. "You offering advice, or signing up for the front line?" For a beat, Mason was silent. His gaze drifted beyond the camp, to where the stars blinked coldly above the horizon. He thought of his wife's face, of his father's voice, of the flag wrapped around his arm like a second skin. Both, he said finally, voice low but unshakable. Ren gave sharp nod. Good. You'll lead the west flank with Kayla. Kayla's eyes widened, but she didn't object. Mason straightened, the weight of exhaustion momentarily forgotten. He reached for his rifle, checked the magazine, felt the familiar slide of metal and muscle. A breath escaped him, slow, measured. As the camp settled into tense preparation, Mason found himself alone at the edge of the ravine, the wind cold against his face. Kayla appeared beside him, arms crossed over her chest. You really think we can pull this off? She asked quietly. Mason watched the distant flicker of enemy lights. I think if we don't, no one will. Kayla was silent for a moment. Then, softly, what's it like where you're from? He didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted inward, back across stars and time, to fields of green, to porch lights, to laughter that rang through summer air. It's quieter, he said at last. There's a kind of peace you don't notice until it's gone. Kayla smiled faintly, eyes glinting in the dark. Sounds nice. They stood there for a long while, two figures against the vast, cold dark, until the night swallowed the last of the daylight. When the call to move came, Mason fell in with the fighters of the west flank. His limp had grown worse, but adrenaline was a better crutch than any brace. Kayla moved beside him, her rifle light but sure in her hands. Across the field, Ren signaled. The plan was brutal in its simplicity. Hit hard, hit fast, and keep hitting until the enemy broke. Mason had lived through enough wars to know that plans were often the first casualties of battle. Still, as they crept toward the enemy lines, he felt something stir beneath the layers of fatigue and pain. The old, familiar fire, the iron pulse of purpose. The first explosion ripped through the enemy's perimeter with a shudder that rattled the ground. Mason was already moving, pulling Kayla behind a fallen transport as plasma, fire sizzled overhead. He barked orders without thinking, his voice cutting through the chaos. Left flank push. Keep low, keep moving. Kayla was a shadow at his side, her shots sharp and precise. Around them, the rebels surged forward, a tide of desperate defiance against the galactic war machine. Mason caught glimpses of the enemy commander, a hulking figure directing fire with ruthless efficiency. He knew they had minutes, maybe less, before reinforcements arrived. They reached the outer wall in a rush of smoke and flame. Mason slammed his shoulder against the metal, teeth gritted against the pain in his leg. Kayla dropped beside him, breathing hard, eyes wild but focused. Charges set. Mason demanded over the roar. Kayla gave a breathless nod. Ready. Mason sucked in a sharp breath, fingers tightening on his rifle. On my mark, he muttered. 3, 2. The explosion tore through the wall, sending a shockwave that flattened them both. Mason hit the ground hard, vision swimming, ears ringing. But when the smoke cleared, he was on his feet, hauling Kayla up with him. Through the breach, the heart of the enemy stronghold waited, exposed, vulnerable. Mason's heart slammed against his ribs as they surged forward, a ragged chorus of battle cries rising behind them. He didn't feel the pain in his leg anymore. He didn't hear the shouts or the gunfire. For a moment, all he knew was forward motion, the pull of something bigger than himself, the weight of every face he'd ever fought beside pressing him onward. As the rebels poured through the breach, Mason caught a glimpse of the enemy commander turning, eyes wide, mouth twisting in a snarl. Their gazes locked for a single heartbeat, and in that instant, Mason understood. This was the moment that would turn the tide, not just of the battle, but of everything. With a breath that tasted like ash and victory, Mason charged. The blast echoed in Mason's ears long after the dust settled. Bodies surged through the breach, rebels pouring into the stronghold with a desperation that burned hotter than their fear. Mason moved as if possessed, his wounded leg dragging, but never halting, his rifle an extension of his will. Kayla was at his side, breath sharp, eyes alive with fierce determination. Together, they carved a path through chaos, the din of war swelling around them like a storm. The enemy rallied with terrifying speed. Plasma fire lit the dark like jagged lightning, and from the upper tiers of the fortress, mechs lumbered into view, their cannons pulsing with lethal energy. Mason threw himself behind a shattered column, dragging Kayla down with him. The air trembled as the mechs opened fire, and debris showered over them in a deadly rain. "We need cover fire on those mechs," Mason bellowed, voice ragged but commanding. A rebel squad peeled off, weaving through rubble, their weapons flaring. Mason saw one fall, a boy no older than 16, but there was no time to grieve. He checked Kayla, brushing ash from her face, eyes locking onto hers. "We move now," he said, breathless. She nodded, jaw set, no trace of doubt in her gaze. Together they sprinted, weaving through the twisted wreckage, hearts hammering in tandem. Mason's leg buckled once, sending him sprawling to the ground. Pain flashed white-hot, but before he could rise, Kayla was there, arm under his shoulder, hauling him upright. "I've got you," she growled through clenched teeth, her wiry strength a lifeline in the storm. For a moment, Mason glimpsed the child beneath her hardened shell, and a fierce surge of protectiveness flooded through him. They pressed on, weaving between enemy lines, drawn to the fortress's heart where the commander waited. Mason knew instinctively that victory hinged on this confrontation, that without the enemy's leader, the Galactic Soldiers' resolve would fracture. He could see the commander now, a towering figure in black armor, his helmet crowned with the insignia of conquest. He stood at the top of the central dais, issuing orders with mechanical precision, unmoved by the slaughter below. Mason felt the weight of every battle he'd fought press into his bones as he advanced. His mind flicked through memories like pages in a burning book, faces of fallen friends, the laughter of his daughter, the warmth of a home he might never see again. The commander turned then, and their eyes locked across the chaos. With a roar that tore from the marrow of his soul, Mason surged forward. Kayla was a shadow at his flank, her rifle spitting fire. The commander's guard closed in, a wall of armored soldiers wielding shock batons and heavy rifles. Mason didn't flinch. He dove low, sweeping the legs of the nearest guard, his rifle cracking against another's helmet. Kayla moved with lethal grace, a blur of speed and precision, each shot placed with devastating intent. One by one, they carved their way through, until only Mason and the commander remained on the blood-slicked dais. For a moment, time slowed, the sounds of battle falling away like a curtain. The commander raised his weapon, a massive energy blade that hummed with brutal potential. Mason tightened his grip on his rifle, fingers trembling but unbroken. The first strike came fast. Mason barely dodged, the blade slicing the air where his head had been. He retaliated, ramming the butt of his rifle into the commander's side, but it was like striking steel. Pain lanced through his injured leg as he stumbled, falling to one knee. The commander loomed above him, blade raised, the cold glow of his visor reflecting Mason's defiant gaze. It would have ended there, if not for Kayla's cry. She hurled herself into the fray, tackling the commander from behind. They tumbled across the dais in a tangle of limbs, Kayla's fists a flurry of desperate fury. Mason pushed to his feet, vision swimming, every nerve screaming in protest. He leveled his rifle, heart thundering, breath ragged. But Kayla's scream tore through the air. The commander rose, shaking her off with brutal force. Kayla crumpled to the ground, her small body shockingly still. Mason saw the crimson blooming across her chest, saw the fragile thread of life fraying before his eyes. Something inside him snapped. With a guttural roar, Mason charged, slamming into the commander with the full weight of his body. They collided in a crash of bone and metal, staggering dangerously close to the edge of the dais. The commander's blade flashed, carving a line of fire across Mason's side, but he barely registered the pain. He wrestled the blade from the commander's grip, the weapon clattering across the stone. For a heartbeat, they were face to face, two soldiers shaped by war, trapped in a moment of raw, silent understanding. Mason saw no humanity behind the visor, only the void of a conqueror. And in that moment, he knew what he had to do. With a final, ferocious surge, Mason drove the commander backward. They teetered at the edge, the battlefield spinning below. The commander's hand shot out, clutching at Mason's throat, but Mason twisted, using the enemy's own momentum. With a brutal wrench, he sent them both crashing to the ground. The commander's body struck first, crumpling with a sickening crack. Mason hit hard, the impact stealing the breath from his lungs. For a long, terrible moment, he lay still, the world reduced to blurred motion and muffled sound. Then, through the haze, he heard it. Kayla's voice. Weak, barely a whisper, but unmistakable. Mason. He forced his eyes open, dragging himself toward her. Each inch was agony, but he refused to stop. When he reached her, he saw the pallor of her skin, the tremble of her lips. Her eyes fluttered open, and she gave him a crooked, weary smile. "Did we win?" she murmured. Mason's throat clenched, emotions surging like a tidal wave. He cradled her head in his hands, brushing a blood-matted strand of hair from her face. "Yeah," he rasped, voice raw. "We won." Around them, the tide was turning. Rebel forces surged through the stronghold, the Galactic Soldiers scattering in disarray. Mason saw Ren's figure in the distance, saw the rebels raising their battered weapons in triumph. But in that moment, none of it mattered more than the fragile, stubborn spark of life flickering in Kayla's eyes. He squeezed her hand, his grip firm despite the tremor in his fingers. "Stay with me, kid," he murmured, fierce and tender all at once. "You're not done yet." Kayla's eyelids fluttered, her breath hitching in her chest. Mason felt the raw edge of fear cut through his exhaustion, but he held fast, pressing his forehead to hers. "You're going to live to regret running into this fight," he whispered, half a laugh, half a sob. "But you're going to live, you hear me?" Her faint smile was his answer. The nights stretched long and cold, the fires of war flickering against the sky. Mason stayed by Kayla's side, watching as dawn's first light crept across the horizon. Around them, the rebels worked to secure the stronghold, their cheers quieted now, their exhaustion settling in. But within Mason, something burned bright and unbroken. He looked down at Kayla, at the girl who had fought with the heart of a soldier, and felt a fierce surge of hope. They had survived the unthinkable. They had stared into the void and refused to yield. And as the sun rose over the battered world, Mason knew one truth with unshakable certainty. The fight was far from over, but so was their will to rise. The cold morning air bit into Mason's skin as the sun crept higher, casting fractured beams across the ruined stronghold. Smoke curled from the rubble like ghosts, whispering of the night's carnage. Mason stood watch near the makeshift infirmary where Kayla rested, his body aching with exhaustion, but his mind sharp, alert. His uniform hung in tatters, the fabric stiff with blood and soot. Yet beneath the grime, a pulse of determination stirred in his chest. Inside the infirmary, Kayla stirred, eyes fluttering open. Mason stepped in, crouching at her side. Her breath came shallow but steady, color slowly returning to her cheeks. "You stayed," she murmured, voice rasping but tinged with a faint smile. Mason brushed a hand over a bandaged arm. "Not going anywhere," he said softly. Their gazes locked, and in that shared silence, an unspoken promise passed between them. Outside, the rebels gathered, a sea of weary faces streaked with soot and sweat. Ren approached, his grim expression softening when he caught sight of Mason. "Scouts report pockets of Galactic Soldiers regrouping at the eastern ridge," Ren murmured, crouching near Mason. "They're wounded, desperate, but they're not retreating." Mason's jaw tightened, eyes flicking to Kayla's fragile form. "We finish this," Mason said quietly, "before they rise again." Ren nodded, placing a firm hand on Mason's shoulder before rising to his feet. The camp stirred to life, weapons repaired, wounded tended, plans whispered. Yet Mason's gaze remained on Kayla, a silent war waging in his heart. Duty called him, but leaving her felt like walking into the abyss. As if sensing his turmoil, Kayla reached weakly for his hand. "You have to go," she murmured, fingers brushing his knuckles. Mason bent forward, his forehead pressing briefly to hers. "I'll come back," he whispered fiercely, every syllable carved from the marrow of his being. She gave the faintest nod, a flicker of her old fire in her gaze. Outside, the rebels prepared to move. Mason pulled himself upright, strapping on battered armor and slinging his rifle across his back. His legs still ached, each step a quiet rebellion, but he pushed through the pain. The path ahead was clear, in the fight before it swallowed what remained of their hope. As they advanced, Mason scanned the terrain. The eastern ridge loomed, jagged rocks casting long shadows. Galactic soldiers clustered in the distance, their sleek armor dulled by battle, their ranks thinning. Among them stood a figure Mason recognized instantly. The second in command, Captain Vor, a brutal tactician known for his ruthlessness. Mason's pulse quickened. This was their final gauntlet. The rebels fanned out, weaving between shattered walls and craters. Mason led the charge, voice sharp, movements decisive. Plasma fire erupted as they clashed, the air vibrating with the shriek of weapons. Mason's world narrowed to a tunnel of motion. Dodge, aim, fire, move. Around him, rebels fell and rose, the ground drinking in their sweat and blood. Captain Vor emerged from the chaos, his blade igniting with a hiss of deadly energy. Mason met his gaze across the carnage, two predators locked on a single purpose. They collided with bone-jarring force, weapons clashing, fists striking. Mason gritted his teeth, muscles screaming, but he refused to yield. This was no longer just a battle. It was a reckoning. Vor's strikes came swift and brutal, testing every inch of Mason's endurance. But Mason fought with something Vor lacked, a reason beyond orders. Every blow Mason delivered carried the weight of Kayla's survival, the rebels' hope, the memory of the fallen. When Vor knocked him back, Mason rose again, driven by a fire that could not be extinguished. The fight surged to a fever pitch. Mason drove Vor back, seizing an opening as the captain stumbled. With a final, breathless roar, Mason slammed the butt of his rifle into Vor's chest, sending him crashing to the ground. Silence rippled through the battlefield as Galactic soldiers faltered, their morale shattering. But Mason didn't gloat. He stood above Vor, chest heaving, and spoke quietly. "It's over." Vor's visor flickered, a faint crack snaking across it, and Mason saw, just for a moment, the flicker of defeat in his eyes. Then Vor's head slumped back, and the resistance line broke, Galactic soldiers scattering like ash in the wind. As the rebels secured the ridge, Mason stood at the edge of the battlefield, staring across the smoking ruins. His body trembled, adrenaline draining, but his mind turned only to one thing. Kayla. He retraced his steps with grim determination, passing wounded rebels offering nods and murmured thanks. The camp was a patchwork of exhaustion and triumph, makeshift flags rising among the debris. Mason reached the infirmary, pulse thundering in his ears. Kayla lay where he'd left her, eyes closed, chest rising in slow, steady rhythm. Mason sank to his knees beside her, brushing a hand over her hair. She stirred, lids fluttering open. "You made it," she whispered, a hint of wonder in her voice. Mason's throat tightened. "We made it," he corrected softly. For a long moment, neither spoke. Around them, the camp buzzed with cautious hope, but inside that tent, time seemed to hold its breath. Kayla reached for his hand, her fingers still trembling but stronger than before. "What now?" she asked, voice a thread of sound. Mason let out a slow breath, eyes glimmering with a mixture of exhaustion and resolve. "Now," he murmured, "we rebuild. We remember. And we make sure this never happens again." Outside, the rebels began to gather. Fires flickered to life, faces illuminated in the fading light. Mason helped Kayla sit up, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. As they emerged from the tent, a ripple moved through the crowd, eyes turning, voices quieting. Mason supported Kayla, his arms steady around her, and for a moment, all the grief and loss, all the blood and sacrifice, condensed into a single, undeniable truth. They had survived. Ren approached, his face softening as he looked between them. "The people need to see you," he murmured. Mason gave a faint, weary smile. "We're not heroes," he said, shaking his head. "We're just the ones who kept getting back up." Kayla squeezed his hand, her gaze steady despite the hollows beneath her eyes. "That's exactly why they need to see you," she whispered. As the crowd pressed in, Mason felt the weight of their victory settle on his shoulders, not as a burden, but as a promise. He looked out at the faces around him, saw the scars etched into their skin, the weariness in their eyes, but also the flicker of something fierce and unbroken. Mason lifted his chin, drawing a breath that tasted of ash and dawn. "We've lost much," he called, voice carrying across the assembly. "But we are not lost." His words rang out, quiet at first, then growing stronger. "We fought because we believed in something bigger than fear. And as long as we stand, as long as we remember, then they have not won." A murmur rippled through the crowd, swelling into cheers, laughter, tears. Mason felt Kayla lean into him, her small frame a quiet anchor. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, he allowed himself a moment of stillness, of gratitude. Yet even as the camp stirred with the beginnings of celebration, Mason's gaze turned outward to the horizon. He knew better than to believe peace would come easily. Scars ran deep. Wounds festered long after the last shot was fired. But amid the ruin, amid the rising embers, he saw the fragile, stubborn shape of hope. Kayla's voice broke through his thoughts, soft but sure. "They'll regret underestimating us," she murmured, a faint smile tugging at her lips. Mason gave a quiet laugh, the sound rough and unpracticed. "They already do," he replied, his arm tightening around her shoulder. As night fell, the rebels gathered beneath a broken sky, their voices rising in song and story. Mason remained at the edge, watching, listening, letting the weight of survival settle into his bones. He thought of the friends they'd lost, the battles ahead, the fragile peace they'd carved from the jaws of war. And in the quiet between breaths, he made a silent vow to honor the fallen, to protect the living, to carry the fire forward no matter how dark the path became. For Mason, for Kayla, for every soul who had bled and wept and dared to hope, the fight was not over, but neither was the dawn.